Welcome back to the Changemaker podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. My guest today is Scott Mackey. Scott staffed both of Obama's presidential campaigns and spent 6 years based in D.C. working in foreign policy. 3 of these years were spent starting and then running a George Soros-funded Afghanistan advocacy organization. So you basically get burned out. You finally accepted that not only were the systems, and I love this point of view, of the world you would place your trust in broken, but you also needed help. So you got therapy. I was in the belly of the beast for 9 years. I get it. Actually, when I got out of office, I went to see a counselor for like 2 months. I think I've never said that publicly, but so you're in the belly of the beast. But a quote so you've got a new novel coming out called Love Is Not the Answer, which is a political satire. But a quote from the novel captures how your personal growth has affected your political beliefs. Quote, our politics reflects our society, and our society reflects the people within it. Until people choose to heal, grow, and align with themselves, we will never effectively address the political, economic, and environmental crises that are tearing this country apart, unquote. Today, Scott is an author, activist, and entrepreneur working in the nexus of spirituality, politics, and social change. Dude, you're a man after my own heart. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Scott Mackey.
Welcome to the Changemaker podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Yeah, Deke, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, man, as I say, my guest earlier today or on a podcast recently said, you were in the belly of the beast. So I was in the belly of the beast at the local level, but you were in the belly of the beast in Washington. So how did you get involved there? And just for our listeners and our viewers, describe a little bit about what that was like and kind of what led to your burnout.
Yeah, well, we'll encapsulate 8 years down into a couple of minutes here. But so I initially got I never planned to work in politics, but like a lot of 21, 22-year-olds were doing in 2007, 2008, I got given a copy of Dreams of My Father's, and I became obsessed with Barack Obama. Yeah. I almost drove out to Iowa when I graduated college in 2007, and not doing that remains a regret. I moved to Guatemala instead, but I was still obsessed with, future President Obama. And after he won in Iowa, my 22-year-old brain was like, Barack Obama is going to be president. The sins of our past will be redeemed in the future of the Obama presidency. And then he lost New Hampshire a week later, and my 22-year-old brain broke down. All of my wonderful assumptions about the future that we were now guaranteed were gone. But I was living in a city called Quetzaltenango, and I was walking around late that night, so depressed. I just had this voice in my head that was like, you can do something about this. And so the next morning I got on Skype, I started calling like grassroots or field offices in the US. And I got on the phone with this woman who's become a really dear friend named Jillian Bergeron. And she was like, yeah, just show up and volunteer. So the next day I hopped a bus to Mexico, where I caught a flight into Charleston, South Carolina. And that's how I ended up on the campaign. Fast forward, a year plus, the campaign was done. We had won. My intention was to go to Peace Corps, but my hope was that in going to Peace Corps, I would then, have the credentials and the experience where I could get a job working for an NGO. I wanted to work in foreign policy. So again, brain was like, this campaign went pretty well. You can probably just go to DC and get a job working for an NGO now. So moved to DC and then ended up working in an NGO called Internews for several years on the, call it, congressional affairs side of things. But that was what got me into DC. The campaign's a lot more interesting than the time in DC a lot of ways, but went really deep on Afghanistan while I was there, which was a wild time in its own way also.
Well, it's interesting to me, and I want to get your take on this.
Yeah.
So I made mention that, so I'm a founding partner with Starts With Us, a national nonprofit trying to move us away from polarization. So we did, we, along with a lot of the other bridging organizations, have had a lot of research done, not polling, but on how Americans feel about politics and polarization. So I spoke at the National Governors Association in New Hampshire a couple months ago. So one of my fellow panelists was a researcher at Dartmouth. So their research showed that 75% of Americans want to see Congress work together in bipartisan fashion to solve our big picture issues. So, we had the debacle of the speaker's race here back several months ago, but one member of Congress, I think it was Jim Jordan, who was nominated, said, well, we can't have a coalition government because nobody in America wants to see that. And I'm like, so Dartmouth's research and all this research says, and this is not polling, this is actual academic research, says 75% of Americans want to see you work together in bipartisan fashion. So when you're in the Beltway, it just seems to me that the majority of Congress, not all, but are very out of touch because they're just in that bubble. Well, so what was that like, living within that bubble?
Yeah, well, that was my exact experience. And so, two points here. I grew up in rural East Texas in a town of 2,000 people, an oil and ranching community. The enemy growing up was Bill Clinton. It was a family where my dad was, in our garden listening to Rush Limbaugh sort of thing. That was my background, my growth that led me to, being on the 2008 Obama campaign. Part of a story, not for right now, but because of my background, I had always felt, even once I got into politics, that I had this really clear understanding of how people were feeling or interpreting the world differently. Yeah, I was a kid on the Obama campaign. I'd become liberal, quote unquote, but I still had these rural East Texas roots. By the end of my 8 years there, I had lost that completely. And that was part of what led me to leave, is when I would read a headline or I would see something happen and I would switch into my mind that, how is this buddy or this parent of a friend interpreting what's happening right now? I really didn't know. It was this, piece of me that had been alive, or an instinct or an intuition I had that I had lost. And that really bothered me. And so, if that's one piece of the puzzle, that happens really easily when you're there. And then two, when you get in the system, you're there to win.
Yeah.
Politicians aren't rewarded for doing the right thing. They're not rewarded for making progress. They're punished when they do something wrong. And so I think the instincts in electoral politics and the instincts for all of us who end up working for them is to not make mistakes. And that is just an example of everybody within the system responding to the either intentional or unintentional incentives of the system. So an idea where we don't need to do the right thing, or we don't need to lead, we need to not make mistakes, or we need to reflect people's values back to them. That's a politician responding to the incentives of the system. And then a belief that no one wants nonpartisan progress. If you're in a world where you just have to win a primary where the extremes of your party are voting, and where you're raising money from headlines and media appearances that are primarily playing to your small dollar donors who are often going to be the extremes of your party, then that's your reality. You're just responding to the system as it exists. And then Jim Jordan's attitude is a logical outcome of the political system that we've allowed to be built around us.
Starts With Us, we did some research a couple years ago that showed that, and Paul's research is what it is, Paul, but that 87% of Americans are tired of the extreme polarization of politics. Mm-hmm. So I talk a little bit about the tyranny of the minority. Because I'm a literalist. So serving as mayor for 9 years, I'm like, okay, I'm a public servant. I'm there to serve, not just the people that voted for me, but I've got a constituency of 200,000 people, and I need to represent as best I can, divining the greater good. I need to focus on trying to represent the best interests of everybody. And generally, serving the greater good, everything came out in the wash. Not everybody loved every decision, but if they knew that you were honest and had integrity and were trying to do the best for the greater good, that people supported it. And I think I mentioned to you, I had a 72% approval rating leaving office. But I just don't know, can you do that? As you say, we've redistricted to where we've got all these safe districts. And I mean, we've built the system that is just failing.
Right. I think the system is failing, and we desperately need systemic change. In a two-party system where any practical person working within it can say, sure, maybe the parties are similar in a lot of ways, but we do have different values. And if I want my values to be expressed in policy, and we use much more loaded moral language than that, but if I want to see my values expressed in policy, then the most important thing is for the Democrats to win or for the Republicans to win. That's a logical step for any good person working within the system to make. So once you make that step, then your job as an elected official who is within the Democratic or Republican Party is singular. Your goal is to win. Because if you have more seats in the House, you have more seats in the Senate, the same is true on the state level, then your values are going to be able to be expressed in policy. So your job isn't to lead, your job isn't to serve your 200,000 constituents as you were able to do as mayor. Your job is to win the next election. And if you are in a safe seat, then your job is to raise as much money as possible so that you can donate that to your colleagues or future colleagues so they can win their more challenging election. And then the nice side effect of that is you also are going to have more power in the next session of Congress if you've raised that money and you've given that to your friends who are also running. None of those incentives are service. All of those incentives are winning and raising as much money as possible by, creating as much clickable content as possible in the language of our day.
Well, so at the National Governors Association event in New Hampshire, Robert Gates was also a speaker, former Secretary of Defense in Republican and Democrat administrations. But he said, look, we've always been politically divided as a country. So that's not new. He said, what is new is for the extremes on either side to demonize the other side and say, they're the enemy and we need to destroy them. He's like, that is something that's new.
Right. It's destructive and it pays. That's a lot of the challenge right now. Like my book, Love is Not the Answer. It's, can talk about the book in a bit, but there's really two streams of thought through it. The one idea, and it's related to the quote you read earlier, but the foundation of every crisis we're facing or that we think we're facing right now as a people is a spiritual crisis. And that spiritual crisis could be called an emotional crisis. There's a variety of ways to phrase it, but that aside, the second crisis is that our systems are broken. And we have to reform our systems in a way where our leaders or future leaders or potential leaders are going to be incentivized to perform on behalf of the people in this country instead of maximizing the power or profit for the systems of this country. And those are our political systems. Those are also our economic systems. And I think, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this as well, but I think there's a world where those reforms are really simple to talk about and make. The really hard part is building political momentum in a world where elected officials from both parties are incentivized not to pursue reform because it will limit their own collective power or personal power and profit in the end.
Well, and I just, when they're in the system, do you think they can even see this? Because that to me, this hyperpolarization, so I did a series of videos for Starts With Us after I was diagnosed with cancer, which
Right.
Fortunately, I'm cancer free, but I compare polarization to a cancer. I'm like anything that is separating us from our families, our friends, our communities,
Mm-hmm.
it's effectively a cancer. It's contributing to a failing health of our nation. And it's interesting. The economy, the stuff that you read, I mean, jobs are being created and everything, but there is inflation. But overall, people perceive that we're in a terrible economy.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, do politicians actually even understand what that behavior is doing to the country, to their constituents? You know, and I've kind of felt like the extremes, it's gotten so ugly that the extremes don't want a huge, they want their base to come out, but independents in the middle, let's just leave them out because it's easier to control an election where we just have to depend on our base.
Yeah, we all like control.
Yeah.
Love control. I I I think politicians are like all people, know that they're not a homogenous
Yeah.
group in the end.
No,
I think
no.
a lot do understand what like the reality of the system and what it is forcing them or others to do. I think a lot also believe that, and electeds, but this is true for, the thousands and thousands of well-intentioned people who work like in politics in both parties, but they believe that they have to make these compromises, like compromising their value
Yeah.
or their values, because it's what's necessary to win. And like the world is as it is, the system is as it is. Reality is what we live in. And so we just have to respond to reality as it exists. And a lot of our electeds, just like is true of a lot of people in this country now, like our value and a lot of our identity is actually tied up in political party affiliation. And if our identity is tied up in our political party, it becomes a zero-sum game. It's not about making progress. It's not about getting things done. It's not about making policy. It's about winning or losing. And if you lose, even if a good thing happened potentially, it's still like a piece of you is being attacked or dying. And that's a result of us having just two political parties.
Yeah. Well,
So,
Andrew Yang is also a movement partner with Starts With Us.
mm-hmm.
And I've been doing some dealings with the Forward Party.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny. I made the comment last week that if you're effectively bringing people together on common ground or presenting an alternative, you're cutting into the market share of the extremes. So the Forward Party initially wanted to get on the ballot in all 50 states by next year. Now they're trying the strategy is just in the swing states because the Democrats and Republicans in the other states fought to keep the Forward Party off the ballot. So they've got sort of a monopoly. But it's funny to me because it is. So I tried to model for generations that were coming along when I was in office the same behavior that I saw of the people that I admired in politics. I'm 56. You might not even remember this, but there were actually statesmen, and just Democrats and Republicans, and there really were Reagan Democrats, and Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan really were friends. And when Ronald Reagan got shot, Tip O'Neill really did go to his hospital room and pray for him. And I'm like, even that's, over time, that's not really on the time continuum that long ago, but we've gotten to this place, just in the past couple decades.
Yeah, I feel like I've observed that happen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I remember, Gore Bush in 2000, Bush Kerry in 2004, and then worked in politics after that for a decade, basically, and have observed it through that entire time get worse and worse and nastier and nastier. And I've had my dad in my ear the entire time for 15 years telling me things weren't nearly as bad as during the Vietnam years. And for the last 5 or 10 years telling me things have got much worse in his feeling. But, he has a much like you to a lesser degree than my dad, but have a much longer historical lens than I do.
Well, and I was discussing this with somebody not too long ago. So when Barack Obama announced his candidacy, I said, he's going to win. And I said to a friend of mine who's a Republican lobbyist, I said, Barack Obama's going to win. He's like, he's got no chance in the world. So I'm like, no, he's going to tap into at the national level what I tapped into at the local level, because I never went negative. I offered hope. And I'm like, there, and I was speaking at a church service this week, and I'm like, there, that is the concerning thing to me, because I don't exist within a silo, but I talk to people, and based upon, what they are fed by the media and everything, so many people are just losing hope in general in the country, which is scary to me. I mean, that taking pride in our nation, I'm like, when we're painting this dystopian, picture of the country as it is or as it could be in the future, I'm like, go live in, Israel, go live in the Ukraine. Our reality. I did a podcast last week, and I was telling the host, I said, same with us. I'm like, I can do your show for an hour. Nobody's editorializing me. Nobody's coming and beating on the door saying, you can't say those things. We do live, I still feel like, in the greatest country, but it's all in the perception.
Yeah, well, it's perception. Like, our sense of well-being is simply the gap between our expectations and our perceived reality.
Yeah.
That's it. It has almost nothing to do with the actual circumstances that we're facing or that we are living through in any given moment. It's what are we expecting, and then how are we experiencing it? And what we do know is that any person can do a lot of work to manage their expectations or to change how they experience their world and their life around them. And that's based on beliefs, and that's based on a lot of, call it like more internal or subconscious work that we can do. But yeah, we're in a pretty dark place as a people. And what we do, and we were talking a little bit about this before we came on air, but we're at a time when everybody is unhappy. We all have had our leaders or others identify a potpourri of things to be against, but we have so little to be for right now. We lack hard political alternatives. We can be against something, but what do we opt into? And I think we also lack a story about ourselves that allows us to be honest about our past while also acknowledging what we've gotten right and providing hope for a future that we can work towards together. And without that, then we just know what's wrong. We know things don't feel nearly as good as they did 20 or 30 years ago. And we just end up in this loop of negativity that I think has caught all of us up in it right now.
But it's interesting too. I mean, I think the 24-hour news cycle obviously has something to do with that. I was watching a documentary on 1968. So Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. The death rate in Vietnam was, staggering. Lyndon Johnson announced he was not running for president, didn't tell anybody. So, and then, Nixon gets elected. So I'm like, and you had unrest and, riots throughout the country. I'm like, if we had, the 24-hour news cycle in 1968, we would have really, I think, was 68 like the Manson murders too? But it's like all these terrible things happen, which probably, if magnified through the 24-hour news cycle lens, would look worse than what we're facing now.
Oh, yeah. If everything that's happening all over the world is getting reported on in great detail, and in a time where, news it's a revenue-driven business. Revenue is driven by eyeballs watching the news and clicks on links. And what gets clicks and eyeballs is sensationalism and catastrophe. And so again, it's like systems, this is incentivized within our media. We allow this to happen because we buy into it. We're the ones clicking the links. We're the ones watching the shows. But it's
but it's interesting
yeah.
because I grew up a punk rock fan. My listeners, viewers know that. So I like to rebel against authority and go against the status quo. But that's what I did. My running for mayor was an experiment in democracy. And
Hmm.
like, okay, if I offer an alternative, people will go for it. So I had a 3 hour a day radio program call in on conservative talk radio. So I didn't know anything about radio. I didn't even know where to plug my headphones in when I went in.
Hmm.
But the local station canceled Glenn Beck and replaced him with me. So it was the furthest thing from, conservative talk radio. We had live music on Wednesdays. I had Democrat and Republican politicians. I had Al Sharpton, who I got to be friends with through James Brown. I had Chef Jose Andres. But the sales manager at the station told my then assistant that my show made more money for him than Glenn Beck's ever did. What did they do? Because it didn't look like typical conservative talk radio, they canceled me and replaced me with Glenn Beck. So it's even if you show there's a viable, profitable alternative, it's just like, but I made this comparison to a reporter yesterday, and I had on the show not too long ago. I'd love to get your take on this. Ariana Picari, who was a longtime producer for MSNBC, who quit to protest, basically network journalism. She said, they won't let me be a journalist. But so, I was talking to her about it. The major network news sources, they're losing market share. They're starting to lose money. Their audience is going somewhere. But it's like with the print media, it was like when digital came out, oh, a fad. We don't need to change. But I get the feeling of that with the broadcast journalism as well, broadcast media. And Ariana, I said, how accurate are ratings, which is what they base every investment on? She said, they're not at all. I said, because I would compare them to polling, and pollsters are still calling landlines. So they're making all these major investments on bad information. It's crazy.
It's nuts. I cannot claim to understand the logic top to bottom. But one thing,
There is none.
one thing I do believe though is that like the large media companies, especially their businesses, they are following dollars in the end. They are trying to make decisions that they think are best for their business,
For their
and that
shareholders.
is leading to significantly increased polarization. But to your point, like, why do you think with a show that was doing really well, you got canceled back in the day? Because I was just listening to your story and I was like, I don't know. And it is always surprising to me that there aren't more. And I can think of examples to the contrary. I might bring them up in a moment. It's like really surprising there aren't more successful, moderate or reasonable or just alternative voices. And maybe it's that alternatives are hard right now.
Yeah, but I view what I do as total rebellion because the status quo is extreme polarization in the media and politics. And I'm like, so I'm connected to a lot of people in the younger generation. And I'm like, man, rebelling is cool. And, rebelling against the status quo. But I think that, Generation Z, there's so much that goes on that the media does not make us aware of. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to ask if you've ever heard of this group, and you may have, but the Millennial Action Project, now called the Future Caucus. So they've been active in Washington for years now. So here again, they're recruiting millennial and Gen Z legislators in Washington, teaching them problem solving. So that age group grew by 40% in Congress last year. That age group is getting more bipartisan legislation passed than any other age group. Have you ever heard of them?
No, never.
No. And, so I was speaking, there's a group called the Young Professionals of Augusta that it's 20 and 30 something year old young professionals. I spoke to them 2 weeks ago, told them about Millennial Action Project, now the Future Caucus. Hey, these guys are your peers. Have any of you ever heard of them? Nobody. And I'm like, I think that that's newsworthy and pretty damn cool that you've got 20 and 30 somethings in Congress that are actually solving problems, but no media coverage whatsoever. And, here again, there are 500 bridging organizations active in the U.S. One group, Braver Angels, went to Gettysburg right after the 4th of July, had hundreds of people at Gettysburg, Democrats and Republicans, 3-day conference. You might have been there, but basically no news coverage. I'm like, just the optics on that are so cool. That they're there in Gettysburg trying to get people from differing political views to work together. So it's working, but it doesn't feed into the media narrative.
I was going to say, it doesn't fit a convenient narrative. Well, what do we name the narrative?
We call it the bridging movement.
Bridging movement. Familiar with that.
But I'll tell you something cool. And so I'm trying to me, I want to change the paradigm on what's cool. And, being popular on social media and getting 500,000 followers. Okay, I know that that's how some people judge their worth. Not me. I'll tell you a cool story. So like a month ago, this couple, I think their band's name is the Bergamon, but Jillian and Nathaniel. So they grew up in South Bend, Indiana. They're going to be guests on the show, but they're people of faith. But they were living in Brooklyn. So in 2016, their music is so cool, but they felt called to go on the road, in a station wagon and promote unity and peace. They spent 8 years doing that. So they've just done a documentary. They didn't know how to make a documentary that is now up for an Academy Award. So their documentary called The State of the Unity. I'm like, so two, 20-something-year-old, 30-something-year-old newly married couple goes out on the road promoting unity and peace for 8 years and now has a documentary that's nominated for an Academy Award. I'm like, that is pretty cool to me.
You're like, come on. That's the thing. Yeah. Well, they're up telling a story, creating an alternative. The optimistic angel on my shoulder looks around the country. Look at the polls that are, 60+% of Americans want, an alternative party and alternative presidential candidates. Like all of the organizations represented in the bridging movement. Your ability and my ability and so many people like us ability to sit down with, progressives in cities and to go back to the small towns that we came from and sit down and talk with like the MAGA folks that we grew up with and still discover that we can share our common humanity and that when we get beneath the surface, we are people who are looking for security for ourselves and our family, who want our kids to do well and who understand love and want to express it in our lives. Yep. And so my hope is that is a movement that is sitting below the surface. Donald Trump did not create everything that we associate with Donald Trump right now. No. He tapped into a vein that existed. My deep hope is that there is a person or an organization, a book, or a movie that is there that will eventually be able to tap into this existing vein that none of us can quite see and none of us can quite put our finger on, but we sense its energy building. And that when that gets tapped into, that, it's always happens. It feels like change isn't happening. It feels like nothing's happening. We're beating our head against the wall. And then all of a sudden, boom, everything's different. And my prayer is that we are working towards that moment in the next 1 or 6 years. I don't know.
I think we are. And, I've had some offers to do something that would be back somewhat dealing with politics. But I've prayed about it. I'm like, but I'm so free to be, I'm like, I can go, I'm flexible. I can go try to be, a change agent for these bridging organizations. I'm like, put me on a plane and get me in front of, whatever audience anywhere. because this is what people want. And I think you're going to find that with your book, providing people with an alternative, but there's got to be a catalyst, and it's got to be more than one. It's like I'm the CEO of the Future Caucus, Layla Zidane. I'm like, she said, I want you talking to my members of Congress. I'm like, happy to do that, because I tell, the millennials and Gen Z, I'm like, next year you will be 40% of the voters in the United States. You want power, you've got it. But you need to get more people representing. I'm like, it is.
You have to go take it.
Yeah, you got to go take it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I was 37 and knew nothing about politics when I did this. So I'm just trying to fire them up and be that catalyst and go, come on, it's very cool to be a part of a movement. And I tell people, when I ran, we had a bunch of 20 and 30 something year olds, knew nothing about running for office. It was fun. I mean, we had such a good time and nothing negative about it. People rallied around it because it was like, okay, if you want to have fun and change the city, come on, join with us. There was no, you need to do this because we're going to threaten you into using fear and intimidation. So if it can happen in Augusta, I think it's scalable when I see all of these groups. So one thing I did with my musicians out of Brooklyn, they were aware of some of these bridging organizations. I've been plugging them in with as many as I possibly can so that they can help. I'm like, you guys need to be the soundtrack for the bridging movement. It's possible. You're a part of it.
I think it will break through in time. I don't know what form that breakthrough will take. And, to folks who haven't been paying attention, it'll look like this one person came along and just out of nowhere, all of a sudden built this enormous national movement of some sort. But that'll be because there were thousands and thousands of people and tens and hundreds of thousands of people around their dinner table who were having the conversations and doing the work. Everybody like getting in or creating their own lane and then doing the work.
It's interesting to me. So when I was doing a speaking engagement virtually in London recently, and I was saying the majority of people are, they're not extremists. They, basically want to live in clean, safe communities. They don't want to be afraid of their neighbors and everything. But just looking at the media, you feel like you're in the minority. I'm like, we need to provide platforms for people that are really in the majority. But somebody, in the chat room said, are we really in the majority? And I'm like, yes, we are, but we need to have ways to bring all these people together and to make them aware of each other. But I think, and I want to get into your book, but I think your book is going to do extremely well because that vein is out there, and I think but nobody's marketing to them, because it's like, well, the vocal minority is who pays the bills. Let's get them stirred up.
I think it's like, what is a centrist or a moderate or someone who just wants people to get along? Like, those are all negative definitions. And I think that probably it's an incomplete description of what we might call the middle. Because I think like when you get into the middle, you define that it's it's like a hodgepodge of individuals with a significant number of different worldviews or ideologies or beliefs who maybe are just connected around the fact that they see that both our political parties are bought and paid for by corporate money and are designed to win elections, not to serve the people. And that media, as we understand it, is really a business arm of these political parties, et cetera, et cetera. It's like we all see that something's wrong, different ideologies and worldviews. But again, like, what is the thing that group or a large percentage of this group that we call independents, what is the story we will get behind? What is the thing that we will be for? And is that a new political party, or is that just a reform platform that everybody can get behind? I think that is like when the person or the movement builds that positive alternative that people at scale can start opting into.
Yeah.
That is when the wave will crest.
And that's the thing to me, is that I've always focused on common ground. And
Right.
I'm like, I'm using my own cancer. I'm like,
Mhm.
I lost my mother to ovarian cancer and my brother to pancreatic cancer. I'm like, I don't know anybody who, through a friend or a family member or themselves, have not in some way, shape, or form been touched by cancer. So that's a commonality. And
Yeah.
it's like, or just loss in general, or I don't know anybody who hasn't been impacted by, in some way, mental illness or addiction issues. So that creates just a common bond of humanity, to where I might not agree with you politically, but yeah, I lost my mom to cancer too. And so I can connect with you over grief over losing a loved one. So I think there's so much common ground out there for us to come around on, but we've got to seek it. I mean, when we totally define ourselves politically, I was talking to a friend of mine that very conservative Republican. He's a Christian. I was talking to him yesterday. He's like, for a while there, I defined myself by my politics. My politics became my religion. He's like, but they aren't anymore. So
But
I
that's
think
the
that's,
exact thing that's happened to a lot of this
yeah,
country, and especially
yeah,
as we've become a less religious nation, as
yeah,
religious affiliation has plummeted. The like that has cut down on the local communities that we're part of, which is its own, I think, negative side
oh yeah,
effect. But also that left an identity gap, and it's a lot
yeah,
of work. And it's like this is the healthy thing from a psychological, spiritual, or emotional perspective. This is what we all should be doing, is doing the work to get rid of all of the I ams. So that in the end, we recognize that like we are the beloved. The divine's love, or the spark of the divine, is within us, and nothing that we do or nothing that we might say that we are or can do is where our value comes from. But we live in a world that we're taught our value comes because our family accomplished this. My job title is this. I am from this town. That is my political party. And when we're putting our value externally, that makes us very vulnerable to the effects of the world.
man. But I will tell you, I'm a Christian. I don't begrudge anybody their own faith tradition or lack
Mm-hmm.
thereof. But I always, I was in real estate sales. I wouldn't sell anything to somebody I wouldn't buy myself. I ran a nonprofit. I wouldn't ask anybody to give money to something I wouldn't give to myself. So I like to make compelling cases.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, okay, I went through 6 months of intense chemo, immuno, and radiation therapy. I never had a side effect. No hair loss, no weight loss. I was going to the gym 5 to 6 times a week. I am cancer free. I'm like, I'm a walking miracle. So, and I've even had friends say, you made me revisit my faith because of how you've handled this and how you've
Mm-hmm.
gotten through this. So that to me, but I think, and I want to get your take on this, I've shared with people, in churches, I'm like, I think when we start putting, and this goes into, saying, well, you have to be of this socioeconomic income status to become a part of this church. Or when we start putting stipulations or walls, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, the gospel is open to everybody. It's the most
Yeah.
inclusive thing you can be. But when we start saying, no, if you're not of this political party, don't come to our church. If you're not of this socioeconomic status, I'm like, I mean, Christianity to me is so inclusive. It's open to everybody. And that's the part of it that I'm focused on. And I'm not going to judge you because you're from a socioeconomic status. And I've said, I'm like, look at Jesus. He's hanging out with sinners and prostitutes. And, he was about as inclusive as you could possibly get. They did crucify him, which, but he
Yeah,
rose
they
from the
did
dead.
crucify him. Yeah. I'm excited for you to have a chance to get through my book because there is an entire conversation we could have that probably is not the conversation for this moment. That is theological, that is about the nature of God, the nature of faith, the nature of interfaith dialogue, even. That is rich. But, it's like a little bit about my background. I don't know if you know this. Like, my parents were missionaries. I don't know if you're familiar with the organization Mercy Ships, which is an enormous international global organization of hospital ships. But my parents were both OG Mercy shippers back in the late 70s, early 80s. Like, my mom lived on the beach in Greece for 2 years when this organization got their first broken down ferry that they were starting to remodel by hand to turn into their first hospital ship, which eventually became the Anastasis. So like all this is like, I come from a very faith-driven background from, parents who are odd in a variety of ways, and all people are odd and interesting once you get to know them. But, like they were theologically very conservative, fundamentalist in a lot of ways, very politically conservative from an American political perspective as well. And they would not have used this language, but effectively obsessed with social justice. They read the New Testament, and their takeaway was that, to whom much is given, much is required. So they lived to serve. And, that's the family that I came out of. And there's negative elements of that, because they also had negative for me at least, but they had a very narrow vision of faith in the end. It was very hard for me to fit into. And so I was actually student body president of a Christian college called George Fox. I loved God so deeply. And I also, again, this is a longer story, but for the purpose of my next point, I walked away from the faith as well at the age of 22. It was like a 5-year-long process where I had decided that the evangelical faith as I saw it in America could not possibly be the faith of Jesus, who I felt like I knew so deeply. And so I went searching for truth with a capital T. I prayed. I was into meditation. I became obsessed with mystics, whether you're talking Brother Lawrence from back in the day or Khalil Gibran from farther back in the day or Thomas Merton more recently. And in the end of that process, I ended up leaving the faith because I was like, God is real, religion's not. And then I had a interesting 10 years where I effectively cut God out of my life. And I first felt that as freedom because I had got taught so much fear about salvation, and I had had so much judgment baked into me around those who were different kinds of Christians or didn't believe the right things. I think how a lot of my generation has experienced the church in this country. But then when you read my bio earlier, it was like, I kind of realized I was a mess. For me, that started with getting into therapy. And that was a years-long process where, I started going really deep and was like, oh, I can actually completely rewire myself because no person ever does anything irrational. Every feeling, every response we have is for a reason. And there is an emotional root of that. You can go back to that emotional root, heal it, change it, rewire it, and then your current experience is going to change. Like I went through a long period of that process, radically changed my life. What I kept coming back to was what I would call a God wound. I had loved God more than anything. I was raised in the church. I was raised by two people who had sacrificed their entire lives for or to serve Jesus Christ. And then I had a time, for reasons because of my own hurt and my own wounding, had effectively taken a knife and I'd cut God out of my life. And with it went shame and judgment and a sense of betrayal. And I also lost love and compassion. And as I saw that I had lost that, there was no way that I could get it back without revisiting what I initially thought of questions about God. But what led to, for me, just this profound spiritual awakening. And so that gets me all the way back to the short answer I was trying to give you probably 5 minutes ago before I started rambling. God is everywhere and in everything, my belief. Absolutely, and certainly within the church. But God is a living being. And I think what's so often, and especially in this day and age when people have access to an entire world's worth of knowledge and experience, is if you turn God into something that is based on belief, as religions of all stripes are prone to do, and certainly as evangelical faith in the US is prone to do, knowing the living, breathing, cosmic, creative force that underlies all creation, but you have to believe certain things to touch that force or to benefit from that source or to feel love from that force. You are cutting anyone who is in church off from the most profound power that exists in a religious or a spiritual existence. And so as the church has become more and more about belief, I think the reason numbers have suffered so much is that people are no longer experiencing God in the church. And so they try to go find that somewhere else.
Man, we could talk for hours and hours on that, but I will tell you, so having cancer has been like a religious experience to me, and it's been a ministry because I've gotten to share, my hope and my light with people going through chemo, which is very scary. But I was driving to a speaking engagement in middle Georgia in this rural area, and I'm like, because people say leadership can be lonely, and it can. So I'd had this young man that's the CEO of Bridge USA tell me, he's traveling around. He's 24 years old. 3 weeks out of the month, he's on the road. He's like, it can get very lonely. I'm like, well, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to mentor you, and I've got your back. But as I'm driving through Georgia on this beautiful day, I started thinking about loneliness. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Lord, I just realized that through the divine spark you've put within me, I'm a part of your creation. Every raindrop, every blade of grass, leaf on every tree, I'm a part of all that. And so I'm never alone. And it's so interesting. So when I talk to people, because we live in a world where people can feel so alone, people just somehow, and I'm like, this might sound hippy trippy dippy, but it's not. Somehow that connects with people and their eyes just open up. And I'm like, that's the coolest thing when they have that moment to realize, as alone as I may feel, I'm never really alone. But that's what you're talking about, getting in touch with the divine.
Absolutely. I think the notion of oneness is a revelation or, like a known felt belief that has, I think sat at the center of every mystical tradition through history. And it's also what you're going to experience if you eat mushrooms or drink ayahuasca or, sit with any of the new they're certainly not new, but increasingly popular psychedelic therapies, is that, that creates a state change the same way meditation or fasting in the desert creates a state change. And as you strip away ego and the self of the physical body and get closer to, the spiritual or the soul reality of what we are in the inside, there's this deep awareness we all have that we're connected, and science is getting on board. The world of quantum makes that very clear.
Well, we could talk all day, and so I do want to get to your book in a minute, but I will tell you, I had a guest on my podcast, Wiz Buckley, former fighter pilot. He had PTSD. And so he went to Mexico with a group of Navy SEALs and spent the weekend doing ayahuasca and everything. It was under medical care, but he is a champion for natural medicine. And he's like, I would have kicked my own ass 5 years ago if you'd said I was going to be out there championing this. But he's like, why do me and these Navy SEALs have to go to Mexico to do this that rewired our brains and probably saved our lives? But, you can't do that in the U.S. That would be a discussion for another day. But I did want to say, he said he saw
that's part of the book. So
good. I can't wait to read it. But he said he saw a meme of Jesus saying, I gave you every cure you ever needed through nature, and you made all of them illegal.
Yeah. So one of my protagonists is named Jonathan Robinson, but he's a veteran who, in a sense, he found healing from, his own PTSD experiences working with my protagonist, who is an elderly mystic named Julia Connor, who uses psilocybin, so magic mushrooms, to work with veterans who have PTSD. But, the reason, that's always, or that is on my heart and found its way into the novel is when I worked in DC, the 6 years I spent working on Afghanistan, I worked with a lot of veterans, but also active duty military members of one sort or another. And that's when I was in Afghanistan. That was also in DC working on policy questions and issues as well. Had a ton of friends from growing up who served.
Yep.
And then, so like I've spent a lot of time in, call them natural medicine circles myself over the last 4 or 5 years, but have sat in ceremony or just late nights at my house hanging out with so many veterans, who we as a country like send off to war generally while we pretend we're not at war here at home, who we ask to do so much for us that might be protecting or might just be, fulfilling a political whim of an elected. And then, we have barely acknowledged them when they come home, but also don't provide them access to the type of healing communities that best facilitate any healing any person is going to do, which it's the medicine, but it's also just the community and the support and being closely held in a secure environment where you know that you're safe.
Well, and that's, here again, we get into the loneliness factor and the mental illness. I mean, it's just, we live in a complex world. I do need to hook you up with, this guy's name is Wiz Buckley. He's an intense dude, but you guys are on the same page. Well, so you've talked a little bit about your book. When does your book come out? The name of the book is Love Is Not the Answer.
Yeah, so the book releases on February 6th, and pre-sales will be available, and I'm going to get the date wrong. It's mid-January. I should memorize that. But 3 weeks in advance.
Well, I believe I've been asked to write a blurb for your book. So did I get to read an advance copy?
Oh, yeah. Well, if you don't have one yet, I'll remedy that as soon as we're off the air.
It's great.
Oh, yeah.
Great, right?
Yeah, I'll make sure that you get that again afterwards. But yeah, so the book, the shorter than an elevator pitch, just the tagline for the book is when the power of love threatens to reform the two-party political system, the war on love begins. And then the little bit longer synopsis or elevator pitch is effectively, so like my protagonist, her name is Julia Connor. She's a 72-year-old beekeeper, gardener, and love-obsessed mystic who also happened to be a pioneer using psilocybin to treat veterans with PTSD. So Julia and her best friend, who is this veteran, Jonathan, are discovered by this young, angry, kind of shock jock, fear and anxiety-ridden TikTok influencer, although the platform is called Beep Beep in the book. And her name's Mel P. So Mel P, So Mel P discovers them. She thinks their whole story that people can heal, and by healing we can find common ground and heal our political divide, is total bullshit. Excuse my language. So she initially sets out to expose them, but in the process becomes obsessed with them, starts creating content, and fast forward a little bit, lo and behold, before you know it, Julia Connor, this aging mystic, has gone wildly, insanely viral, and they all together have launched this enormous, statistically significant national movement to bring love and compassion into politics. So now we have a statistically significant love vote, and both political parties are pandering to the love vote, trying to claim the mantle of love for themselves. But in their efforts to pander to the love vote, they piss the love vote off. And so the love vote turns around and drafts this aging mystic to run for president as an independent. A little bit of magic happens. She actually gets in the ballot in all 50 states. She gets into the race. She's tied for the lead with both major party candidates. And at that point, she and love itself have become a mortal threat to the two-party system. And so both political parties, corporate interests, and the largest megachurch in the nation all declare a war on love to maintain the status quo. And we trace that war to Election Day. It's a fun book. It's also really serious.
I cannot wait to read that. But, it's like connecting with my musicians out of Brooklyn. I'm like, I know, God has connected us. And I'm like, that movement is going to happen. But it's like, God is still doing a great work out there. Like, I want to shine a light on it about people. That's why I do this podcast. People making a difference that don't believe that, the situation is as it is never going to change. And so let's just throw our hands up and check out.
We're the only ones that can change things.
Yep.
Like it, if we live in a system where we feel like our political or the economic systems aren't working for us because they're working for them, shareholders, the wealthy billionaires, whatever we want to call it, like, yeah, that's probably true. But like, that's not going to change unless we do the hard work and choose to take responsibility for recreating the systems as they exist in our world. No one's going to do that for us. And that's true in every person's individual life. Like, this is deeply unfair, but in the end, no one is going to do anything for you. So we all have a responsibility to take control of our own existence, to take responsibility for our actions, to learn what it means to know ourselves and to live in integrity with who we actually are. And in doing that, then you find you have this beautiful freedom to just live as yourself within the world. But it's also true collectively. If we want politics to change, it means society is going to have to change. And if society is going to change, it's because you and I, Deke, and all those that we know take responsibility for creating new alternatives.
It sounds like the name of a nonprofit I've heard of called Starts With Us.
You know, I was Googling that recently. I can't remember the details though.
Well, man, you've been an awesome guest. As we wind down, where can our listeners and viewers find you? Where can you find Scott Mackey?
All right. Well,
Austin, Texas.
Beautiful. Scott Mackey in Austin, Texas. So one is just the book's website, loveisnottheanswernovel.com. The second is on Instagram, just Scott Mackey Writer. And then I'm trying to be on TikTok myself. And like, Deke, I'm a Luddite, basically. I look fairly young, but I'm like an 80-year-old man sitting in this body, just like shaking his hand at all the technology sort of thing. But I've been told you can't sell books without, building a following, creating content and all that jazz. So I'm making an honest run. So I'm also on TikTok at Scott Mackey Writer.
Well, cool. Well,
yeah.
Yeah, you kind of have to, it can be used for great good or great evil. I did connect with, my musicians out of Brooklyn through Instagram. So
it's a tool.
So my last question is, so on a daily basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
I love being outside, and what I feel the most are like trees in the water. Because I live in Austin, Texas. I moved here because there's this place in town called Barton Springs. It's this enormous spring-fed pool, twice the size of an Olympic pool, surrounded by sloping grass hills. Millions of gallons of water come through it every day. It's always 68 degrees, clean and clear, unless there was just a flood. I go to Barton Springs to connect to myself, to connect with this, the force that we call source or God, and to see friends. That's the thing. And I fly fish.
I was out there when I was in town for the partners meeting with Starts With Us. So we interviewed, it's called Starts With Us on the Street. So my voice was messed up. I usually was the one interviewing, but I was out there. I did not get to swim in the springs, but somebody was like, man, when you come back, you got to do that. So when I'm back next spring, I'm definitely going to do that. But
I'll take you next time you're in town.
Cool.
We're
going to hang out too.
Absolutely.
All right, man. Well, thank you for being an amazing guest. Bless you and all that you're doing to bring people together and just your mission. So that is all the time we've got. Dropping the mic and we are out.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to or watching the Changemaker podcast today. Greatly appreciate it. If you're listening and you want to see the video, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at Deke Copenhaver. That's pretty easy to remember, I would think. But really, we also want to remind you to like, subscribe, rate across all platforms, download. And if you're looking for a coach, a speaker, or anything, you know where to find me. Just email me at dekecopenhaver.com. And thanks so much for listening.